All right, welcome back to another lesson in our series on church history. So far we've looked at early church debates over the Trinity and Christology and the nature of sin and grace. In general, we call this early period of the church after the apostles. We call that the time of the church fathers, or the patristic period. Today we want to shift from the patristic period to the medieval period. Now the word medieval has nothing to do with evil. Why is it called the medieval period? Well, this was the name that Renaissance thinkers gave to the period of time between classical antiquity, the good old days with the Greeks and the Romans, and their own age of the Renaissance. It was the medieval period, which is just Latin for the medium ages, the age that is between the classical period and the Renaissance. You might have also heard it called the Dark Ages. Well, that was because Enlightenment thinkers viewed themselves as bringing light to the world. Whatever before was dark and unenlightened. Now, there were certainly some dark aspects in the Middle Ages. The rise of Islam, the bubonic plague, the corruption of the papacy. But it's certainly a misnomer to call the medieval period a dark age in general. That's a pejorative term that was used by people in the Enlightenment to try to dismiss the entire Christian error. They claim that it's dark because it's in between the non-Christian pagan thinkers of Greece and the secular pagan thinkers of the Enlightenment. In reality, there was actually quite a bit of light during the Middle Ages. You have the invention of the university in Italy, in England, in the 11th century, in Spain, in France, in the 12th century, Oxford, Cambridge, the University of Paris, all come from this time, as do intellectual thinkers and artists like my namesake, Geoffrey Chaucer, Marco Polo, the inventor of that pool game, Anselm, Dante, Thomas Aquinas, Roger Bacon, the inventor of that delicious breakfast meat, Peter Abelard, and others. This is actually a time of a lot of development and intellectual flourishing. But if you hate Christianity, you'll obviously hate those developments, since by and large they all take place under Christian influence, since the West existed by and large under the banner of Christendom. But let's back up and consider how we get here. As we've talked about before, the first couple of centuries of the church are marked by sporadic persecution, kind of ebbing and flowing in intensity and in extent. Now, with Constantine in the early 4th century, you have Christianity recognized as a legal religion. And then a few decades later, it becomes the official religion of Rome. Now, around this time, the empire is split into two different regions. Constantine had moved his capital to Constantinople, which is today Istanbul. So you have an eastern region centered there. And then you have a western region that's still centered in Rome. Now, unfortunately, the Roman part of the Roman Empire was in some trouble. At its height, the empire had stretched from the Iberian Peninsula in modern Spain through North Africa into Mesopotamia, which is modern Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. But for various internal and external reasons, it had been wobbling. A few of those factors include invasions by various barbarian tribes, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Germans, the Vandals, the Huns, like Attila. You have economic problems and the over-reliance on slave labor. You have government corruption, and you have the aforementioned division of the empire into eastern and western regions. As Jesus and Lincoln said, a house divided cannot stand. So for these reasons and more, Rome is in trouble. Already in the days of Augustine, who we talked about last time. In fact, it was the fall of the empire which prompted his massive work, The City of God. In 410, the city of Rome was sacked by the Visigoths, which marked the first time in 1,000 years that Rome wasn't in the hands of Romans. In 455, the city was raided again by Vandals. And finally, in 476, Emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed, and no Roman emperor would ever again rule from Italy. Now, after the 5th century, going into the 6th and 7th century, we see a number of fascinating developments. I'll mention 4 of them. Number 1, you have the growth of monasticism, the movement towards the monastery. Number 2, you have a few more ecumenical councils. We've talked about some ecumenical councils before. Number 3, you have the rise of Islam as a rival religion and military threat. We'll actually talk about that next week. And then number 4, you have the growth of the papacy, which we'll talk about next semester. Starting in the 8th century, you have the groundwork laid for something called the Holy Roman Empire that will play a part in Western history throughout the medieval ages all the way into the Reformation. If you've heard of Charles Martel, or Pepin the Short, or Charlemagne, or Otto the First, those are all important figures in the Holy Roman Empire. Now, don't let that name fool you. As Voltaire said, the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But it's a fun name, so go with it. What is the Holy Roman Empire? Well, the Holy Roman Empire was a Christian, at least ostensibly, Roman-inspired political framework that held Central Europe together loosely for a millennium. It claimed to be Christian, charged with defending, promoting Christianity, especially with the advance of Islam. Especially early on, the Pope was involved in crowning the emperor. So over time, you have this power struggle between the papal and imperial authorities. They would clash. But for these reasons, it was called Christian or holy. It also claimed to be a continuation of the ancient Roman Empire in the West. Obviously, the Eastern Empire took offense at this. In fact, that was one of the factors that led to the eventual split between the Eastern and Western churches that we'll talk about shortly. And though it claimed to be an empire, in reality, the power was pretty decentralized. Local rulers had a whole lot of independence. And that became crucial, actually, for the survival of the Reformation. And this system of political power in this Holy Roman Empire lasted all the way until it was disbanded by Napoleon in the early 19th century. By then, it had basically deteriorated to the point of being irrelevant. But as mentioned, this was a time of a lot of developments that factored in the division between the Eastern and Western churches. So let's talk about that. We begin in 330 AD. As mentioned before, Constantine moves his capital from Rome to Constantinople, thus creating two major cities in the empire, each sort of vying for prestige and primacy. Those two regions also represented unique challenges in that the East used Greek, whereas the West used Latin. Along with that came different calendars, different holiday arrangements in the East and West. And over time, the bishops of the churches of Rome and Constantinople began to compete for greater influence and authority. Even the way that they approached theology was a bit different. For instance, in the West, they tended to focus more on the unity of the Godhead, whereas in the East, the focus was more on the diversity of the persons within the Godhead. Notice both of them are Nicene, both of them are Trinitarian, both of them are Orthodox in their understanding of the Godhead, but their emphasis, their starting point was a bit different. So for all of these reasons, tensions began to grow. And the straw that broke the camel's back was something called the Filioque clause, where the Western Church added a phrase to the Nicene Creed. Whereas the original creed said that the Spirit proceeded from the Father, the Western Church added the phrase, and the Son. The Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Now, as a Protestant, I actually agree with that addition, but I don't agree with the way that it was added. A creed isn't just something that should be unilaterally changed. After all, what made a creed was the fact that it was ecumenical, that it represented the entire church, the universal church. It wasn't localized to one particular area or one particular language or one particular church. So changing the creed without consulting the East, the West actually sacrificed their Catholicity, which is ironic because the West is called the Catholic Church. Well, the East responded to this betrayal by saying that adding anything to the creed was heresy. So in 1054, the Pope, who didn't like to be called a heretic, excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople. And the Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicated the Pope in response. From here on out, Christianity has been split into at least two families. You have the East and you have the West. You have the Greek Orthodox and you have the Roman Catholic. So all of that occurs within the medieval period. I'll mention a few other developments during this time as well. First, there's the birth of Christendom, the union of the secular and the sacred, the civil and the ecclesial, a society that was quote-unquote Christian from the ground up, bound together by a common faith, culture, and government, though spread over this huge geographical area. So what is Christendom? Well, it's a civilization in which Christianity is the dominant religion, which has this, in which this dominance is backed up by social and legal compulsions. You see that idea affect not only much of Europe in the Middle Ages, but in the Reformation, in places like Calvin's Geneva and even in the birth of America and so forth, are all influenced by this idea. Second, you have the gradual replacement of slavery with a system of feudalism in which people surrender their lands and selves to noblemen in return for protection. Feudalism will then be sort of the major European form of government through much of the Middle Ages. Third, you have the corruption of the papacy and the Roman Catholic Church that we'll talk about in future lessons. Luther describes the monasteries of the medieval period as lice-infested dens of homosexuality. You have popes that are killing popes. You have multiple popes at once. You have monks with mistresses. It was an absolute mess. Fourth, you have some major theological debates with guys like Aquinas. You have a growing cult surrounding the veneration of Mary as Mariology developed during the medieval period. In addition to this, and related to the discussion of the relationship between sin and grace and effort, you have a growing system of sacramentalism that marked the Roman Catholic Church. So again, it's hardly accurate to describe the medieval period as Dark Ages. That's an intentionally derogatory term used by Renaissance scholars to try to paint themselves as being more progressive and more enlightened. In the end, like any period, the Middle Ages had pros and cons. It had ups and downs. Speaking of ups and downs, next week we'll talk about some of the pros and some of the cons of a period we call the Crusades. See you then.